right, so thank you everybody for putting this together, and thank you for attending. Hopefully I can give you guys some insight on Apprenda, but more importantly, the first part of my conversation is going to focus on Upstate New York. So I'll dive into that once I get my slides up. Okay, so I'll start that part of the process. So one of the things that I'm passionate about is Upstate New York, and the reason that I'm so passionate about it is this is where I'm from. I was born in New York City in Queens, but my family moved to a sleepy town named Gilboa, New York. Does anybody know where Gilboa is? Okay, a couple people. Yeah, I know you do, Pat. So it's a mountain town that doesn't have a town. There's no main street, there are no stores, just like hundreds of acres per person. I worked on cow farms and shoveled manure. I worked on a quail farm and was the resident butcher. I mean, literally just like thousands of quails passed through my hand and they passed away in the process. So I grew up doing that and I somehow ended up in software. Stayed upstate, and I actually was debating moving to Silicon Valley at one point when I started my company, but I went to RPI and got math and computer science degrees and found that there was a tremendous amount of advantage being in upstate New York, and that's part of what I'm going to spend time talking about before I get into what Apprenda does. Quick snapshot of the business, though. We started it in 2007. We have about 125 employees in 3 offices. We opened our European office about a year ago, and we've been staffing that pretty aggressively. And we've raised around 57 million in capital over the course of the business's history. And interestingly, the first 3 years of Apprenda's life, 2007, 2010, was terrible. Like, we just didn't know what we were doing. We spent a lot of energy in the wrong market, selling to the wrong market, and in 2010 to 2011, we decided to re-platform the business and do something very different. In 2009, we raised our first round of meaningful funding. It was a $5 million Series A, and we continued raising capital through that process, investing in growing the business. So it's a pretty exciting time for us. As an organization, we focus on selling a software product to the world's biggest companies. We're not a technology that's focused on the consumer or focused on small businesses. Instead, we sell to the JP Morgans or McKessons of the world. We have organizations like state governments as customers. 2 of the big 4 accounting firms are our customers. So really, the energy for Apprenda is around this use case in the software world that we'll talk about in a bit that's focused on the world's biggest businesses. And the reason that's the case, I spent time working at one of those companies. I worked at Morgan Stanley for a year, and it was an interesting experience to say the least. When I was at Morgan Stanley, I got to see what it was like to develop software in a really big company like that, and it was a horrible process. So what we decided to do when we started Apprenda was to solve the problem of becoming very productive developers in the context of these big companies. Large organizations have thousands of developers. To give you perspective, anybody know in the Fortune 100 how many developers are on staff on average at any one company? 10,000 developers in one company. They're bigger than like most of our companies all combined times 4, right? So you think about the dynamic there, and it's pretty fascinating. So they'll have 10,000 developers on staff, software developers, who are not productive, who could be more productive, and our energy is focused on that. How do we fix the problem of productivity in the developer ranks of these big companies? So we also got dubbed as an anti-Silicon Valley startup, and this was in the print version of Forbes. It's an interesting article that they got written up on Apprenda, and I spent a lot of time interviewing with the writer about this. And to a degree, not only am I pro-upstate, but I am a little bit anti-Silicon Valley for one reason, and I think Dane mentioned this earlier, but you can't replicate that model. What happened with the Valley is it became the pinnacle, right? This is what everybody should be. And the circumstances that created Silicon Valley are very different than the circumstances that can create something similar in an area like this. And if we don't acknowledge that, we over-rotate on investing in characteristics that we just don't have as a region. Interestingly enough, for those of you that don't know, Stanford University was started by somebody named Leland Stanford, who came from Waterville, New York, right? So kind of funny little piece of DNA fact there. But the reason that I am so anti is I do believe that it's set up a lot of people for, I think, a misguided future around what's going to make a region successful and what makes companies successful. Being an upstate software company is interesting because I do think there are characteristics that are valuable. And this first bullet that I have here is that every location has advantages and disadvantages. If you take another region like Silicon Valley and try to project it over upstate New York, you will find that you're going to amplify some of our disadvantages, right? Currently in Silicon Valley, you probably have some of the best talent on earth with respect to so many topic areas. We just don't have that, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. It's acknowledging the things that we are good at. And for me, in my business, being close to the customer is really powerful. Within a 2.5-hour drive from Troy, I can be in Manhattan. And I've read, I think it was, I don't want to misquote it, but I think it was a Deloitte report that said this: 60% of the world's IT budget is defined within 30 miles of the island of Manhattan. Pharmaceutical companies, media companies, banks, you name it. It's just massive, massive opportunity. So one of the advantages we have in upstate New York is we have proximity to some of the world's biggest companies. So when I think about building a company in upstate New York, one that focuses on, say, Fortune 1000 style companies has a density property that we can't replicate in Silicon Valley. If I did move Apprenda to Silicon Valley, I wouldn't have access to the banks and pharma companies and media companies that I do today and that ended up being some of our first customers. Second, one thing that I think is true is that most of the time, success is a consequence of solving a problem that has some sort of value behind it. It's not about where you are. I think that's misleading. Understanding that sometimes you have to fill your gaps by opening other offices, then you go ahead and do that, right? That's okay. We open an office in Manhattan and have 25 people there, not because we're not invested in upstate New York. Headquarters is in Troy. It's still our biggest office, and it continues to grow. But because when we need certain specialized skills, we have to go outside of the region to find them. That only bolsters our ability to be a successful company in this region. So I'll pause on that topic for a bit and just get into what we focus on as a company. And the main topic area that kind of drives Apprenda's vision is that if you look at any large organization, they're all becoming software companies. If you go to an organization like Caterpillar, a company that makes bulldozers, or John Deere, who makes farm tractors, they now have GPS-guided, software-driven tractors, right? And they'll map out a field, and GPS will drive where it goes, and it does everything it needs to do. So fundamentally, there isn't a company on earth that isn't becoming disrupted or doing its own disrupting through software, and that's pretty fascinating. We've seen this happen a couple of times, right? One is Blockbuster. Think about Blockbuster and the dynamic there. When I was a kid, I would go to Blockbuster and I'd rent movies. That doesn't happen anymore. My two daughters go on Netflix and watch whatever they want. There are no commercials, nothing like that. So it's interesting to see what software has done in these different markets. Borders is another one. If you look at Amazon, Amazon's to the point where they're talking about delivering goods, including books, to people with a drone. I mean, that's fascinating. And again, it's a software-driven business for a business and an industry that historically wasn't software-driven. So I think the power that we're seeing is that software itself is democratizing disruption. The word disruption is so overused and cliche because it's everywhere, all the time. And it's predominantly driven by the fact that all of these companies can now do amazing things with software. We've even seen this in the annual reports of certain companies. So McKesson is one of our customers, and I forgot which year it was. It could have been 2014. If you look in their annual report, 2.7% of their revenues came from their software business unit, MHS, but it represented 25% of EBITDA at that company. So the leverage was 9-to-1. So if you're the CEO of McKesson and you can invest an extra dollar in distributing syringes or in software, where do you put the money? You put it in software. So this is why we care about this so much. We think it's the biggest, probably most tectonic shift we've seen since the Industrial Revolution in any market. The challenge is that new companies like the Netflixes of the world have a very easy time building brand new software businesses. They don't have any baggage. There's nothing anchoring them. They don't have $3 billion of IT investments over the past 20 years. They have a clean slate and they can do whatever they want. Existing organizations have 10,000 developers with old skills. They'll have a bunch of IT investments they've made that are no longer relevant, and they need to somehow leverage those. That inertia is something that I think is penalizing to them when they're thinking about their disruption, and it's a really difficult problem to tackle if you're a big company but you want to become a software company. Our focus has been how do we build a software platform that we sell and deliver that to these organizations so that we can take all of their IT assets and turn them into one big unified system and make it where the developers in those companies can build applications at breakneck speeds and innovate quickly. It can't take them a year to get a new piece of software out the door. They have to get things out in days, weeks, or months at most if they want to be competitive. So our tech is exclusively focused on this idea that we can help the world's biggest companies build their own cloud technology platform that they can use to build new software very, very quickly. This is boring details, but I'll gloss over it just to give some color on this. What we've found is that when we work with our customers, the top 3 challenges they face is that, one, building what we call cloud-native applications, applications that are delivered via the internet, are probably some of the most challenging architectures for them to solve because they haven't done it before. So those architectures are really hard. Number 2, the traditional processes for deploying applications is really slow. When I was at Morgan Stanley, the day we finished writing code for a project, we were still 120 days away from getting it into the hands of our end users because it took that long to get servers and routers and database people and security people happy so that we can install. So that was pretty frustrating. And third is that it gets very expensive to deliver software via traditional models. So if you're now selling software and it's part of your revenue stream, if you're inefficient, your cost is through the roof and it's not going to work out. Quick snapshot on the types of customers that we work with. So I mentioned the world's largest organizations. I want to dig into one of them. JP Morgan's they were one of our first customers years ago, but now have become one of our biggest deployments. Over 2,000 applications running our platform. and they really focus a lot of energy on how do we, again, build and deploy applications quickly. We've gotten to the point where nearly every line of business within JP Morgan is touching Apprenda technology in one way or another. So it's a pretty exciting thing for us to see happen. But the most important bullet is the bottom right bullet, 70% increase in the developer productivity. So now what we're talking about is 7 minutes that we arguably were wasted of a developer's day are now being reinvested in innovation. So our job, again, is to power that innovation by making sure these developers are as productive as possible. I mentioned one of the big four accounting firms. We also tend to be a very practical technology to implement. We found that, especially in our competitive landscape, there are some very impractical approaches. And the way we measure practicality is how quickly can somebody get from buying our tech to being productive. And in this particular case study, they went from no applications running on our platform to 200 in the course of 40 days, and that included implementation of our tech. So we pay close attention to that because it makes us very nervous if our customers aren't using things that they purchased quickly. We don't want to become shelfware. And last, and this is going back to the whole Upstate thing, we're growing significantly. We're investing a lot still in this region. The Troy office currently has more open headcount than any one of our other offices, despite having a location in New York City and one now in Europe. But we are hiring, and we'd be excited to chat with anybody that's looking to join a team. And then last, if you're starting your own business, the only advice I can give is take the risk. I mean, we're in 2016, not in the 1800s. Back then when you took risks, you probably got cholera and ended up dead. Today, things might get a little hard, but it's not so bad. So give it a shot. Thank you.